500 years ago, Niccolo Machiavelli warned us, "This is the tragedy of man. Circumstances change, and he does not." We are all of us, reluctant to face change. We all want to believe that we can continue doing the same thing and it will continue to work. And even when it fails, well, we won't change until we've finished exhausting the possibilities of blaming somebody else. Even now, there are powerful and popular voices within the conservative world insisting that conservatism is some unchanging thing, that the conservatism of 2009 needs to be exactly the same as the conservatism of 1989, of 1979, of 1959. There is nothing to learn and nothing to alter. I'd like to direct our attention to 4 episodes in our conservative and Republican past where there have been changes, there has been reform, and it's yielded powerful and beneficial results. The first of these episodes involved a group of people to whom their political opponents gave the ridiculous nickname of the Mugwumps. The Mugwumps were a group of Republicans, mostly from the Northeast, who could not abide the corruption and scandal that had gathered around their party in the years since the Civil War. And when in 1884 the Republican Party decided to nominate for president a man named James Blaine, a senator from Maine, a legendarily corrupt figure, these Mugwumps broke away from their party and were willing to cross party lines and vote for a Democrat in that year, Grover Cleveland, famously honest mayor of Buffalo, New York. And by supporting Cleveland, they tipped the state of New York to the Democrats and tipped the election. They were very much condemned, of course, by their more stalwart Republican opponents. What they did was to set in motion a process of reform inside both the federal government and the Republican Party. At that time, just about every job in the United States government was given away to a political appointee who was supposed to kick back a portion of his salary to the party that gave him the job. It was an organized system of not only corruption, but of extortion. The Republican Party, as the stronger of the two parties, got more of the money, and so it was more devoted to the system. But the Mugwumps of the 1880s recognized that this was a system that was bound to thwart every ideal they valued, the ideal of an honest and effective government. The Mugwumps insisted that this system had to change, that the United States needed an honest civil service and an end to this kind of organized corruption, bribery, and extortion, as it often was, in the financing of political parties and in the running of the government. For this demand for reform, the Mugwumps were savagely criticized by their more stalwart Republican allies. They were accused of treachery to the party ideals. They were accused of snobbishness and elitism. But they prevailed. They changed their party and they changed their country. It did endorse the idea and accept the idea of an independent civil service and political reform. The Republican Party, on the basis of this reform, was able to step forward into the 1890s to emerge as, again, the natural governing party of the United States. The second of these episodes involved a group of people called the Progressives, who also get a bad time from history, because they did endorse a lot of wacky ideas. But they devoted themselves to some good and powerful ideas as well. Clean food and clean drugs, national parks, a more honest approach to state and local government, greater professionalism in government, an interest in the collection of accurate and reliable statistics. These people became the foundation of Teddy Roosevelt's governing majority. And they changed the nature of the Republican Party and brought it into the 20th century. The United States in the early 1900s seemed to be headed towards some terrible social conflict. It had the most violent labor relations of any major country on earth. Some kind of alteration of the American system was necessary, both to preserve social peace and also to keep the old party structure relevant in a time of radical social change. Ironically, many of the most important and successful of the Progressives, people like Herbert Hoover and Robert Moses, the great highway builder of New York, would go on to gain reputations as conservatives of another era because they brought to the politics of that later time the same desire for rational reform that had made them progressives in the first place. Their reforms were accepted and digested by the society and became the basis of the conservatism of a later period. I want to direct you to a third episode, the Republican Party's transition from isolationism to internationalism in the years immediately after World War II. Many Republicans had opposed U.S. entry into World War II, including, unfortunately, many of the leaders of the party. One of the most outspoken of the isolationists was Robert Taft, leader of the Republicans in the Senate, who at one point notoriously dismissed the importance even of a German conquest of France. But young men who had gone off to war, who had believed in the Republican ideas of free enterprise and limited government, came back understanding that the United States needed to adopt a new attitude to international responsibilities. These are people like Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon, who came back directly and participated in those first elections after the war. This started an argument that continued through the nominating conventions of 1952, and you can still hear echoes of it in the battles over the Goldwater nomination in 1964. International Republicans were often dismissed by the isolationist and protectionist Republicans of the older generation with the familiar accusations of elitism and disloyalty to party ideals and lack of deference to their elders. They won the Republican nomination of 1952 for Dwight Eisenhower, who went on to win the Republican Party's first presidential victory since 1928. And they built a new bipartisan consensus, more realistic than some of the dreamy democratic ideas of the 1940s, but in which both parties could share credit for upholding a strong international role for the United States. And it was their reformed Republican Party that would carry those internationalist ideas even after the Democrats broke faith with those ideals during the debates over the Vietnam War. In the 1960s, as the Democrats broke faith with traditional internationalist ideas, it was the Republican Party that became the repository of the great ideals of the post-war generation. And it was, after 1970, the Republican Party that emerged for a generation as the party that Americans trusted most to keep the country safe and to preserve world peace. A fourth episode of conservative reform. In the 1970s, a small band of defectors in the Democratic Party, many of them academics, many of them with social science backgrounds, began to produce the research that showed that conservative ideas did actually work better, not as a matter of slogans and dogmas, but with the hard, detailed work of numbers, of study, and empirical research. These people became known as neoconservatives, a term that originated as an insult, like mugwumps almost a century before. They provided Reagan conservatism with a kind of intellectual substance that had largely been lacking from the Goldwater conservatism of the 1960s. And they made it possible for Republicans credibly to promise to govern, and when elected, to govern effectively, as they did in the 1980s. The research and fresh thinking pioneered by the neoconservatives continued to achieve results into the 1990s, when neoconservative ideas inspired both the welfare reform and the crime crackdown of the 1990s, two changes that have made possible the urban renaissance that all Americans now benefit from. Like all the other conservative reformers before them, these neoconservatives were again accused of elitism and lack of deference and lack of loyalty to traditional ideas. But it was on them that the possibility of the Reagan and Gingrich revolutions of the 1980s and 1990s rested. Now it's our turn. Now it's time for a new generation. The conservative cause, the Republican Party, they look tired. The ideas, the themes, the messages of the Republican Party and the conservative world seem disconnected from the lived experience of most Americans today. And rarely in its history has the Republican Party been less popular than it is today, rejected especially by the young. We need a fifth episode. We need a new era of conservative reform, an era that will do for the 21st century, for our time, what the mugwumps and the progressives, what the internationalists and the neoconservatives did in their time. And again, if we do our job, we'll be accused of the same old things, of the elitism, of the disloyalty to the tried and true. But the work is necessary and must not be flinched from, because change is life. The only things that endure without change from year to year and generation to generation are the mummies and the fossils. Political parties represent living people, and like living people, they too must live. And like things that live, they must change. They must adapt to the times. That's our challenge. It is not easy. And I accept this as a personal responsibility. I too have had to face up to the inadequacy of some of my own earlier ideas, to the challenges of a new time. And I try to chronicle that in the writing we do here at New Majority. It's an ongoing discussion. It's a discussion we're going to try to have here at newmajority.com. The core principles of freedom and individuality remain as relevant as ever, as urgent as they were the first time a human being ever thought a dissident thought. But the policies and the methods we use to defend those core principles, they have to adapt. And they have to adapt to the society as it is, not as it used to be. And no amount of lecturing the society and commanding it not to change will prevent it from changing. It will change. We must change with it. If history has any one lesson, that is it. Come join this conversation here at newmajority.com.